Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new Record Club episode of the Jams and Tea podcast, where we spin the jams and spill the tea. And each week, sometimes, occasionally each week, one of us will pick an album for everyone to listen to, and then we'll talk about and review it. And this has been long in the waiting because there is video evidence of us saying that our next Record Club is going to be on Thriller. You know, it just took 2 months to actually get there. But today we're talking about the legendary Michael Jackson, his album Thriller.
Yeah, little album called Thriller. You might have heard of it. The thing was, this album turned 40 on the 30th of November. So August, who is going to be with us momentarily, scheduled it for around then, and then we ran out of time during our recording sessions, and then we got to our year-end list season, and we didn't have time to record then. But I'm glad we've got around to doing it now because, first of all, we don't have to celebrate every major anniversary for every major album, but it kind of feels like it would feel like a missed opportunity for us not to talk about a landmark anniversary of the biggest album from the biggest artist of the 20th century, especially because that artist happens to be Michael Jackson and the album happens to be Thriller, which is like, one of the most schizophrenic albums to ever be one of the best-selling albums.
And not to mention, I feel like Jackson himself is a landmark for the idea of the pop star, in that I don't know or claim to know or have any kind of relevant cultural foresight or anything, but I think it's a safe bet that no amount of people will love another human being the way Michael Jackson's fans loved Michael Jackson. Like, the widespread love and adoration for that man's music is a phenomenon not seen since, well, I mean, the Beatles. And even then,
Jesus Christ. I was going to say, like,
I don't know. Those Swifties are pretty crazy.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, modern day stan armies. Maybe they're just more visible. But you're right. Michael Jackson in the 80s especially, I mean, from the 70s through to the 90s, had this kind of canonical momentum and just general likability that surrounded him. And, we're not here to review Michael Jackson's life. We're not here to review Michael Jackson's personality, even insofar. I mean, we'll review it insofar as it contributes to this album.
You can find plenty of videos on that.
We'll talk about it insofar as it's relevant to the music on this album, but I mean, you've got enough material here to really dig into. And of course, more than Michael Jackson, the human being, it's both more appropriate and more interesting, I think, for us as a podcast to talk about Michael Jackson, the pop figure, the artistic persona, the person who at this point, since becoming a solo artist with 1977's Off the Wall, building on a momentum of a career ever since his childhood, essentially being in the limelight, a heavily anticipated and highly telegraphed solo career, then being the kind of thing where this was an artist who came along twice a decade with an album, right? Like once every 5 years or so, essentially, to drop an album that would then basically dictate, define, and completely center the pop music cultural conversation for as long as basically until the next album, essentially. And Michael Jackson was the kind of figure who carried enough weight and was able to craft and make sure that his albums felt momentous enough for that to work. Not to say there weren't other huge, massive personalities throughout the 80s dominating popular music. I mean, Madonna comes to mind, and also Prince, who is relevant, maybe more relevant for other reasons as well, and who also released a seminal album in the kind of waning months of 1982. Of course, 1999, his massive double album, one of his most biggest breakthroughs on a commercial level, came out just a month before this. So Michael Jackson was certainly emerging and releasing Thriller in a landscape where there was competition, essentially, and where he had to really basically put everything into crafting something that would be able to animate the popular music listening scape and also take advantage as well. This is something you have to really consider when you talk about Thriller, because it's not something that was true of the landscape when Off the Wall came out. Thriller is coming out in the MTV landscape as well. Like, MTV started in around 1980, I think. So MTV is still a very new thing, but also it's a huge thing. It becomes this momentous, immediately massive way for popular music and popular culture to be received, right? And so the biggest thing that changed with the advent of MTV is the advent of the music video, right? The advent of music and popular music as this multimedia thing, essentially this massive, like, we're coming off of the new Hollywood era of cinema in the 70s, where all of a sudden, like, artistic merit is as important as commercial appeal and is a big part of commercial appeal, something that sounds so foreign to us nowadays. But that was filtering into the world of music as well with the advent of MTV, because you all of a sudden had these huge high budget music videos with big directorial names behind them, and also, basically being structured basically as short films, essentially, that were as much about building and fleshing out the persona of the artist as they were about, soundtracking the songs. And so it is through the uniquely 1980s landscape that we then get Thriller, the album, Thriller, the music video, Thriller, the movie, Thriller, the cultural phenomenon, essentially dropping like an atom bomb in the early winter of 1982.
I think if there's one thing that strikes me about listening to and talking about the music on Thrillers, because I mean, this is a very strange place to be in, to be talking about an album like this, because we've certainly talked about big popular albums before, but this is talking about music that most conscious human beings, like music nerds or know basically every lyric to. So it feels almost like we're in a weird kind of cultural miasma where we're talking about something that everybody knows, but simultaneously kind of goes unexamined in the cultural sphere at large for like what it actually is. Because I mean, the era this was brought up in, as Riley said, this is 1982. So what strikes me as kind of interesting about this album and its launch into popular ascendancy is this doesn't really sound like an album that should be popular in 1982, considering that most of it's very synth funk and disco-y. I mean, this is a testament to the fame of Michael Jackson that this came out, and of course, I mean, the obvious sort of groundswell of hype that allowed somebody like him to have a team of people behind him so that he could be on the cutting edge production wise and not have an album like this that sounds like stupendously dated and terrible. But it's an album that feels like it's 10 years like too late to be received by people in a popular sphere, and that seemingly did not matter at all.
Well, it's interesting, right? Because when we listen to the album now, we experience it, and it's leading with its foot forward firmly in the disco world with the first couple of songs, right? But that's not how people initially were kind of, it's not how this whole thing was initially pitched, right? One of the things that's interesting about Thriller is that it's kind of a transitional album. Like, it has some of those elements of disco that you associate with early Michael Jackson. It has these elements of rock that he's really leaning into that would come to basically be what Bad was. And it has these sort of, lovelorn kind of soft ballads sort of speckled throughout the entire thing. And those are kind of what the album is initially pitched as. It's kind of an album initially pitched around Michael Jackson's personality as this kind of, as this sexy but also romantic figure, right? The lead single for this was "The Fucking Girl Is Mine," for Christ's sake. So you're leading, that was the only song that actually came out before the album was released. And then we associate it with the title track.
God.
We associate this album with the title track. Thriller as a single and the Thriller music video was released a full year after this album came out. So this whole album was really being led by "The Girl Is Mine." Second single was "Billie Jean," which I think to this day is probably the most, aside from Thriller, is maybe the one that is the most sort of seminal Michael Jackson song on here. And they're really kind of pitching him as actually, it's kind of hard to really pigeonhole it, because it feels like each song that they release is giving you a different vision of Michael, right? So "The Girl Is Mine" is the first single, which is this kind of, really sort of sappy, love, sort of romantic ballad with this fucking Sesame Street-esque instrumental. And this
romantic in enormous quotes.
And look, we'll get to that when we dive into the tracks individually. But then the second single was "Billie Jean," And then Michael's persona here is the complete inverse, right? Instead of being this kind of, attempting to be anyway, this kind of, charming guy who's like, desperately in love, he's this kind of paranoid, asshole, essentially, who is basically seeing women as trying to.
Well, the girl is mine is certainly more in theory. In execution, one could say that it's actually quite in keeping with the rest of the record.
Yeah, but that's not how it was pitched. But you're right. It's kind of like there's aspects of this album that are quite revealing of who Michael maybe really is, or of aspects of Michael's artistic personality that maybe he isn't trying to lead with necessarily. But there's like this interesting sort of push and pull. Like you have so much of this, which is about Michael as this kind of, a romantic figure, but then you have songs like Billie Jean, and then you of course have songs like Beat It as well, which was the third single, which I guess are trying to position and pitch him as a little bit more of a badass. And maybe the weird lack of commitment to a clear personality for Michael is why with Bad in 1987 he would kind of more holistically and singularly go down that route. But it's really interesting listening to Thriller because it is just this bizarre record with 9 songs that are, some of them feel somewhat tonally consistent with one another, but there are just so many moments throughout it where you're just kind of given a bit of whiplash as to, wait, is this the same record, or is this artist trying to be the same kind of person at this point in time, or are they doing something else entirely? It's a strange experience.
Yes, and I do want to speak a bit to that, the strangeness of the experiences. Of course, Thriller is one of the best-selling albums ever, and there's the part of me that has always wondered if this has had interesting side effects on how the general public view the album format, because it is just a bizarre mishmash of like these frayed bits of Michael's psychology that come together on this just in just bizarre ways.
I've heard people say that this album is a singles vehicle, right? Like it's about the big singles and the rest of it is just kind of there for decoration. And I don't agree. I'm not saying everyone says that, but I've heard that take before. I feel this is very much an album where Michael and Quincy Jones have basically tried to design every song to be big. Essentially, they've designed every song to potentially have an appeal or have a hit potential. And I think that maybe in some way explains the weird sort of heterogeneity of this album, the weird mishmash of different personalities and stylings. Is this, Michael and Quincy don't want the album to sound or feel the same for too long, for more than maybe 2 songs at most, because then it's starting to run together stylistically. Then you're less likely to have each song be a hit. So there's this veering between aspects of Michael's personality, or between genres, or between sounds, almost on a song-to-song basis, that I think reflects the desire to make every song sort of stand out in its own way, be memorable for what it is as its own thing, rather than kind of having it sort of be consistent and approach genre-wise. That's, I think, my interpretation of why the record is structured and sounds the way that it does. They really wanted every single song to potentially be a hit in its own way without having them all sort of blur together.
I think what's happening there when people say that this is just a singles vehicle is that it sort of ignores the fact that there is a very deliberate construction to this album, but in particular these songs as well. It's very deliberate and focused in as strong a way as possible, that Jackson and Jones were using their best judgment at the time to try and make all of these songs as radio ready as possible.
Yeah, I mean, 7 out of 9 songs on this record were singles. The only ones that weren't were Baby Be Mine, which I assume is just because it kind of maybe sounds too similar to Wanna Be Starting Something, and The Lady in My Life, which is kind of understandable because it's just sort of there as the sort of slow jam closer, essentially, to kind of reinforce some of that romantic attitude of Michael's personality. That's obviously going to, sell a lot of records anyway.
I think what's sort of happening there when people say that is they're sort of falling back on that as an excuse for the album's weaknesses in particular, because I think it is a very concentrated effort on all fronts, but just whether or not those concentrations are pointed in a direction that is compelling, let's
Michael
say.
really wants to pitch himself as someone multifaceted, I think.
Yeah, in keeping with the Paul McCartney feature, in terms of just how deliberately they wanted this album to be a unified success. The backing band on this album in particular, and some of the songwriters are Steve and Jeff Porcaro, Steve Lukather. Those three guys are all key contributing members to none other than Toto, who just earlier that year had released Africa. So again, very much a band in the collective idiom at the time, and Jackson was certainly interested in both collaborating and capitalizing off of their immense levels of talent in order to sort of get this album into the hearts and minds.
Yeah. It's funny because as Jake mentioned, there was a little bit of a backlash against disco, or at the very least, like the trends of the 70s that Michael's solo career began within were very much not the trends that were existing in the current moment. And yet those trends had made Michael huge, right? Specifically the sound that he cultivated with Quincy Jones on Off the Wall, which I think explains to some extent why the album itself begins very much kind of in the continuation of that mode with the first two songs as well. You have, again, you're being eased into this new world, I suppose, with something that is kind of like a bone being thrown for people who, I guess, are still think of Michael in that particular way and still come to Michael for that particular thing. And so the way that you approach Thriller is almost two different ways that people approach Thriller. It's either as a cultural artifact in real time where the singles were showing this new direction for Michael, or it's as an album where initially the first thing you hear are these really kind of peppy, fast-paced, incredibly funky disco dance numbers, essentially. So it's interesting the way that the album kind of positions itself as a record versus, as a cultural thing in terms of the way it was being parceled out. But yeah, what do you guys think of the more sort of familiar 70s side of this album in those first couple of songs and the decision to kind of lead it off that way?
Well, I think funnily enough, just because of this album's level of success, I think those tracks still sort of ended up being indicative of where the 80s would go in pop music from here on. I mean, everybody was very happy to announce the death of disco towards the beginning of the 80s, but really disco only changed because its influences are seen everywhere throughout the 80s. It's just different, almost to a degree that it doesn't even qualify as disco anymore in many cases. But this is where that transitional period happens, is pretty much in these first handful of songs.
Yeah, you could almost describe the 80s as kind of being a slightly slowed down version of the 70s. I guess if you were to really, really simplify it in a certain sense, like the 70s were such a decade of like massive artistic possibility and like freedom and this kind of sense of momentum essentially that came out of the 60s. And then the 80s, of course, the Reagan era, this era where everything is so much more kind of commercialized, everything is so much more standardized. It's somewhat of a cynical and reductive view, but I feel like it kind of explains the difference between Thriller and Off the Wall, as well as that difference being a microcosm for how the 80s changed in comparison to the 70s. All this to say, I do like the disco tracks. I mean, I'll be really upfront. I love this record. I think it's a great record. I think for the most part it holds up, even if it's, even if we were to, when we analyze it as a record, as a sequencing of songs, it's bizarre to say the least. It has this sense of massive momentum to it that I find really, really captivating, even if it occasionally kind of almost kneecaps itself in the pursuit of that. But yeah, the disco songs here I think are great. Want to Be Starting Something, Baby Be Mine, the slightly skeevy PYT is also in that mold, but still is a fucking jam. I mean, the synthesizers and the general like tones and stuff that you're hearing there still feel right out of the 70s to me, but also kind of a little bit, I don't know, more sort of saturated, chintzier, definitely of this quality that I associate with the 80s as well. What do you guys think?
I mean, if you're on one end of the spectrum, I'm on the unenviable other end, in that not only do my feelings on this record steer a bit more, I mean, I do like it. Obviously, I have an immense affinity for Michael Jackson and Michael Jackson's music, but I was exposed to it in the format under which basically everyone should, in that I listened to the singles compilations, which is not an ideal way to get exposed to most artists, but I think it is undeniable that Michael Jackson is maybe the quintessential example of what a singles artist is and should be. And by all accounts, I think his artistic persona would have aligned with that sentiment, because his kind of hits or else mentality bleeds over to his reckless abandon for the album as a format in this, and that this occasionally has momentum. I think the center of the album has terrific momentum. Everywhere else, the momentum is it trips all the fuck over itself. For as much as 9 songs can be inconsistent and still largely good, I think Thriller is. And again, make no mistake here, I love Michael Jackson. I love his best songs. I love a lot of the material on here. Hell, I think 2 of the centerpiece songs on here, the title track, Thriller, and Beat It, are coldest take in the universe, 2 of the most perfect pop songs ever fucking made. And those aren't the only highlights either. I also think Wanna Be Starting Something is very, very fucking good. I also really, really love Billie Jean. But the moments on this album that aren't the apex of what Michael was going for, to me, are either moments that kind of pale in comparison to other moments that are already on this album, like PYT, which is a song that I think is good, and yeah, it is kind of skeevy and kind of weird, especially with that little spoken word part at the beginning that I'm just going to not think about ever in my life, ever.
Just imagine
regardless,
imagine calling like a girl, "You such a PYT," like right to her face like that.
And then he has to explain it, which is so much worse. It's like, it's already implied because of the title, but like, I think that generally speaking, this is a good, really well-made song that I dislike being on this album more than I do in its context of just being a Michael Jackson song, because I kind of just think a lot of the other songs that are on here do what PYT does, but a little bit better. Some of the synthesizer tones on this whole album, really, some of them have dated in a very endearingly indicative, cheesy way that I really like. Some of them ride the line a little less successfully, for example. I mean, not exactly tinny. I would describe them as, well, I mean, Riley said it first, is that some of them are just so overly saturated, and it just kind of comes from the displacement of that kind of 70s sound, but with the updated aesthetics of the 80s. And sometimes it can lead to being garish. And I know, Michael wanted to be big. Michael wanted to be garish. It's in keeping with the
Michael
sort of
wanted
tone
to be
and ideas of the record.
That's the only thing he wanted.
Michael wanted to be successful above all other things. And that's, again, why I think Thriller is the album that it is that it has so many pockets and weird moments that no other artist this big and with as many people around him as Michael had would have released if they weren't hell-bent and certain that the rest of it was going to buoy itself, even if they still planned on having all of the record being, or they wanted it to all be successful. I mean, let's get the elephant in the room out of the way, and let's talk about The Girl Is Mine for a second, which is, I struggle to think, in my opinion, at least off the top of my head, I can't think of a better example of the bad song on a classic album.
Well, it's more than that. I can't think of a more impressive or like a more notable example of such a catastrophic failure between 2 such juggernaut creative figures.
Juggernaut creative figures who, again, Paul McCartney, I fucking love. I have deeper ties to that man's music in my childhood than I do Michael Jackson, but he shows up on here and it's like, this isn't the Beatles Paul McCartney. This is Wings, Paul McCartney.
Well, it's McCartney to Paul McCartney. It's
Simply
that,
having
well-
a wonderful Christmas time, McCartney.
That's a better encapsulation of
Yeah.
it, because he comes on here, and what happens is that this song is supposed to be two artists, two heartthrobs that, you know, were captured the minds of many of the opposite and same sex, and the idea is that they are, you know, they're fighting over you, and they're both, you know, being like, oh, I'm here for you, baby, I would never leave you, no, actually I'm better than this other and it just, in concept, it's supposed to be these two guys fighting over this girl, and how there's, and basically it just undermines itself every step of the way by never having the girl in this song display. I'm not trying to be all fucking feminist theory or anything here, but usually in a song like this, you might want to get a word from the girl, like a spoken word thing, or just like a backup vocal, or like something, anything. But this person's opinion, this person's agency is completely displaced. So what you have, in effect, is these two men who sound, I cannot stress this enough, impossibly lame. Both of them. These are guys who had
The
immense
doggone girl
swag
is
in their
mine.
music. The doggone girl. That is the thing that sinks this lower than almost anything else. But the thing that I think, other than the doggone girl, which is very funny, is the moment where Michael and Paul actually have interplay at the very end of the song, and they're like talking to each other, like not singing, they're talking to each other.
Michael, she said I was her forever lover, you know?
I can't tell, like there's a pause there, and I don't know if the pause is coming from immense, visceral, murderous intent, or huge sexual tension between the two of these men. Because it could be either, feasibly. I listened to this song on any hour of a given day, and I would tell you something different. But it sounds like they are about to realize that they're fighting over nothing, and that they should just go be bros instead, even though that's not what happens
I think
at all.
I'm being charitable here, but I think what the song is going for, and it fails at this for a key reason, but I think what the song is going for, right, is it's that kind of like single-mindedness of two guys sort of fighting over a girl. And it's almost like you feel it should be accompanied by, like, you know, a camera sort of panning away from them and seeing some of the girl just kind of walking in the other direction. And I think that's kind of what they're going
The
for with
taxi
that.
driver camera pan.
I feel like that's what they're kind of going for with the end of the song, is that these two guys just get kind of so fucking, you know, wound up in this fixation that they're just sort of like completely blind to the reality of the situation. But also at the end of the day, it's kind of just a goofy novelty song. And I think it is mostly played that way. It's not a very good one. It's annoying to listen to. And it's so bizarrely placed on this record, because if you were to swap this song, and PYT, you'd have an album that is already so much better structured just for swapping those two songs. Because you'd have three fast-paced, like sort of real electric disco tracks that begin the album. Then you'd have the three juggernauts in the center, and then you'd have the three sort of slow jams that kind of lead it out. And I kind of understand maybe wanting to disrupt the slow jams at the end with a PYT, but I still feel that has a bit of a strange effect. The big songs on this are so big and so perfect that they almost don't even bear talking about. I mean, what more could we say about Thriller, Beat It, and Billie Jean? They are immaculate songs. They're intense. I mean, Billie Jean, to be fair, also kind of belongs back in that sort of disco trend to a little bit more, although it incorporates that very prominent sort of funk lick guitar that really kind of brings it towards the rock side of things as a kind of really nice fusion. But then Beat It is like straight up rock and roll, like the biggest pivot for Michael on the entire album, and such a successful one as well. Like, it's just a song that works despite sounding basically like nothing like anything Michael had ever done before. It's actually a really remarkable achievement. I think the biggest achievement for this album. Thriller, the song is great. Perfect, sensational, amazing, very campy, very kitschy, very fun in a way that feels very in keeping with the tone of horror and
evil of the Thriller.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not a surprise that he got Landis to direct the video. You know what I mean? Like
Vincent fucking Price
and Vincent Price on the song. Like, you don't.
Mwah.
It's
And
so
Eddie Van Halen on Beat It. That's
yeah.
backtracking a little bit.
It's a cheat code.
The juggernauts of this album are so impressive because each of them are such a creative risk for Michael. Like Thriller is a creative risk because what the fuck even is it? It's a crazy, stupid, goofy song.
Without the music video as context for Thriller, it is like I saw Thriller before I heard Thriller, like as a wee little baby lad. And I can't imagine the reverse, frankly, just because it is so campy and theatrical. Like it works as a song, don't get me wrong, but like the Vincent Price, like the notion that the concept of this song is Michael Jackson singing about how there's a bunch of scary goblins who are going to come and get you, but that he is going to save you and protect you because he's so badass that he's scarier than the scary goblins. It's so fucking weird, but it works.
Exactly.
So flawlessly.
So, yeah. And as I was saying, so the midsection of this record, the three big juggernauts, each of them are a massive creative risk because Thriller is goofy as hell and it relies on Michael being able to sell himself as a hero in the context of this utterly ridiculous scene that he's set that only really works as a joke if you get the reference points. Then you have Beat It, which is a massive risk for Michael because it's him pivoting, doing a complete 180 from the aesthetic of the music that made him famous and essentially trying to basically co-opt himself into the world of, glammy sort of, I don't want to say hard rock because it's not a hard rock song, but it's certainly kind of inspired by the increasing popularity of that trend, trying to do a song like that as Michael Jackson in 1982, which is a risk. And then Billie Jean, which is sonically more familiar in territory for Michael, but also a risk in the sense that he's making himself sound like a complete fucking asshole with the way the song is written. And it's a song about someone who is, paranoid and insecure and ready to hurl blame at this woman who he's knocked up, essentially. And, in the time that it came out, I'm sure that it wasn't such a risk because it was probably just, people maybe more sympathetic to that perspective that Michael, sings from in that song. But still, each of these tracks feels like it is doing something bold for Michael, which is what makes Thriller such an impressive album because it's a series of bold decisions, admittedly centered in a record that is cushioned around very safe territory on either side, but it is still a series of bold decisions for an artist who at this particular point in time is absolutely not all about boldness, because what he wanted was to have the most successful record in the world and for every song to be a hit. So it's an incredible tightrope walk that Michael manages here, because any of these creative decisions, and you can talk about whether they work for you personally, but any of these creative decisions could have commercially been a complete flop, and yet they all worked. Even The Girl Is Mine went to number 2, right? So somehow he managed to get everything on here to completely work for him and completely go his way. And the deep cuts, if we're reviewing it as an album, certainly the deep cuts maybe don't all hold up as much. I mean, The Lady in My Life is certainly the most nothing song here. It doesn't really hold up. It's a kind of sort of slow jam ballad that I feel like he would do better later in his career, and he had a lot of bad ones. But that said, I do really, really enjoy the dreamy and sort of hypnagogic atmosphere of Human Nature. And it didn't hit me until we were originally prepping for this that the reason I'm so nostalgic for that song is that it's sampled in my favorite Nas song, which is It Ain't Hard to Tell on Illmatic. And I just hit myself for not recognizing that sample sooner. And also, PYT being what it is, I also realized while prepping for this that another reason I'm nostalgic for that song is that it's sampled in one of my favorite Kanye songs, which is Good Life. I don't know why I didn't recognize those samples sooner, because they're so obvious once you hear them when you know the songs. But the cultural imprint of Thriller, all this is to say, the cultural imprint of Thriller is so massive that it's hard for me not to find a level of nostalgia in even the record's most sort of Michael on autopilot moments. So it has this very, very strong connection for me. And I do find the debate around how good is Thriller as an album in 2022 to be an interesting one, because you do have, I think, a bit of a clash or a bit of a need for reconciliation between people whose perspective is like mine, where you just have this deep attachment to all the songs on the record, and people who are maybe a little bit more discerning like you two and not necessarily as vulnerable to that effect.
When we talk about how weird this album is, we need to examine that even the album's undeniable moments, like Thriller and Beat It, again, two perfect songs, are fucking bizarre. And I know we talked about, Thriller, weird premise for a song. Oh, it's campy. Oh, it's goofy. It's weird. Thriller is the most normal song on this album when you look at it at face value. Like, when you judge like what a pop song is and what it does and the effect that it has on you and the effect that the words and lyricism has, that's the one that's easiest to understand.
Yeah.
Beat
also,
It.
it's a campy
Beat It.
in-joke song, right? Whereas everything else on the record is
Yes.
basically Michael being earnest.
Well, and then you have Beat It right afterwards, which is almost the complete opposite. This is the most badass sounding song about being a little bitch ever made. This whole song is about being like, oh, I want to tussle with the guys who are challenging my pride, but also I don't want to get the shit beat out of me. So and through Michael's unblemished charisma at the time, he manages to somehow make this work. Like, this is undeniable. It took me 25 years to understand what Beat It actually was about as a song, because everything in it is so successful that you just don't fucking care. Like, it's just got this hook and this chorus and these verses that are going to imprint themselves onto you for fucking ever, in a way that even the catchiest modern pop songs are never going to do.
Yeah, and you're right. Like, I think you explaining, that kind of slight, not dissonance, but sort of separation from the song's aesthetic and the kind of vibe that it communicates and what it's actually about. I think that's why it's one of Michael's greatest songs artistically as well, because you look at Michael and, even in the early 80s, when he was at the height of his appeal, his sex appeal, his power and all that sort of stuff, you still saw him for what he was, which is a kind of really goofy, earnest, and slightly childlike guy who definitely was not a tough guy, definitely was not this kind of dude who could, kill the monsters. That's why the idea of Thriller is packaged in this campy horror aesthetic, because the joke is that it's all a joke, basically, is that Michael is going to save you from the monsters because they're cartoon movie monsters, right? And the thing about Beat It is that, it's a song about masculinity in a certain sense, and it's a song about like the needing to cultivate a persona essentially to be accepted, and cowardice and all that sort of stuff. And it feels like there's dynamism to that. It feels like there's layers to that. It feels like Michael is showing a self-awareness in these songs that makes them more relatable, makes them more powerful, but also doesn't detract from just how cool they are. You know what I mean? Whereas in Bad, like in a song like Bad in 1987, which is a good enough song musically or yada yada, that doesn't work as well as Beat It, because that is like Michael believing he is something that he isn't and trying to convey that as a acceptable personality. And maybe some people buy into it, but I don't. So that song doesn't work as well for me. But everything does here, because there's this level where Michael is like at the same time somehow doing these completely opposite things, which is creating this persona that's wholly fictional, that is him being seen exactly the way he wants to see, while at the same time being vulnerable, being real, being unguarded to a certain extent. So it's weird how Michael kind of does both those things, and it's one of the things that makes Thriller feel like an actual multifaceted artistic statement, as opposed to just a collection of pop songs. And maybe that's me giving it a little bit too much credit. I'm willing to definitely admit that, but it is honestly, a thing I see.
Like, I'll be willing to back you up here and say that I think that it's like the Clash and the core reason I'm not able to get on board with Thriller as an album is because I think there's something to what you're saying, and that I think that if you really wanted to get deep in the weeds about it, I think you could say that if Thriller has the closest it comes to having an overriding theme is that all of these songs are various examinations of the different types of, archetypical masculinity at the time. Like every single song here relates to that core idea in some kind of way, and then structuring and channeling a facet of it, be it positive or negative, be it ugly or be it appealing or sexual or decidedly non-sexual. That's what all of these songs are. And I feel like that would, in theory, lend this to having to more cohesion. But again, it's Michael and his team of people. It's their approach to making this music that makes it feel like it isn't that, even though it kind of is. These songs, the way they fit together, the way that they're sequenced, it feels like it's actively going against the undercurrent that it definitely does still have, and it makes it a conflicting experience because it's like it's fighting you every step of the way. If you want to treat this like a compilation, or if you want to treat this like a singles album and just a singles album, well, the album itself doesn't really let you do that. And if you want to treat it as an album, like as a normal album experience, like we modern listeners would, it still doesn't fully get there just because it doesn't really have a unifier beyond big. So its lesser moments to me are what really let it down in that respect, because when I can't engage with either of those concepts, I'm stuck in the middle and I just have to evaluate each. Like, it feels kind of mathematical and cold and not the way I like engaging with art, but it has to be like, how do I like this song? How do I like this song? How do I like this song? And more or less it ends up being 3 songs that are the pinnacle of Michael's artistry, 3 songs that are good but inevitably exist in the shadow of that pinnacle, and then 3 songs that I just think are kind of lame. So
yeah, it is. It's a massive artistic gambit at the same time as also being a very calculated attempt at a massive artistic gambit. So there is this kind of wall that it runs into.
It's off the wall, you could say.
Why? Okay. Well, that basically sums up all we could. I mean, we could go deeper on this album, but we'd have to spend multiple hours doing it. I don't think any of us really want to. That is, I guess, the core of what Thriller is to us. We would love to know what the album means to you at home as well at this point. I mean, have you been around since it was released? And if not, how did it come to be a part of your life? Was it something you grew up with? Is it something that you consumed by osmosis as we did? Or is it something you got to come to as its own holistic album statement and evaluate in that way? Really curious to hear your takes, really curious to hear your stories, your history, and what you think of Thriller, the album, in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel if you have not already. We try to do these every week. We definitely do videos every week, and we will be doing more anniversaries of great albums very soon as well. If you want to go above and beyond and support us even more, you can hit the join button, and for just $1 a month, you can support the channel directly, become a member, get your name in the title crawl of every video on this channel. Plus, if you want to recommend us something to listen to and talk about, your recommendation will go to the top of the pile. As always, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Pepsi, the choice of a new generation.